Hi, I'm Baldur Brönnimann, and this is the Conducting Coaching Podcast, where we talk about conducting from the inside. Hi and welcome back. This is the second week looking at conducting contracts and what has to go into contracts. Last week we talked about staff contracts versus freelance contracts, and we talked about fees, some tax issues and so on. But there are many more things that you have to think about when you negotiate a contract. I always assume that you will do that without an agent. So that's why I'm running through all these aspects which are important to consider when you sit down with somebody and fix the conditions for a gig. Apart from the fee, a very important aspect that they have to fix in a conducting contract is the question of accommodation, so where you will stay during the job. There are many ways of handling this. As we said before, there are all-inclusive contracts which assume that there's an all-inclusive fee and the artist will take care of everything else. And there are contracts that deal with accommodation and travel separately. Orchestras who have different conductors and soloists every week, they very often have deals with nearby hotels. Sometimes it's sponsorship deals, or sometimes it's just a package of nights that they buy from a hotel, and then the artists who get booked, they are required to stay in these places. It's usually part of a contract. This can be hotels, or sometimes it's flats. Some institutions, especially opera houses where people are required to stay for a longer time, they sometimes have flats where they put people up. But this is something that usually can't be negotiated because there's just a type of a deal or a situation you get into, and then you're required to stay in where they tell you fundamentally. These kinds of hotels or flats, they're usually quite easy to get to. They're often near a concert hall or near a theater, and quite convenient because, many conductors or soloists are also a bit older, so one tries, to make that the whole access to the hall quite easy, and so on. But there are orchestras who have no deals and sometimes can't provide accommodation because of legal reasons. And then very often they will pay you either your expenses at another place, or they give you a sort of a maximum amount of money that you can spend on accommodation, a contribution, so to say. Let's say you go somewhere and stay for a week, and they say okay, we'll pay you 350 euros or dollars towards your accommodation, and then you have to find your own, and you have to decide how much you want to spend. In any case, if you have to find your own accommodation, if the orchestra pays a contribution or not, you will have to keep your receipts, because you have to deduct these costs from the salary, at the time when you pay taxes. So make sure you keep all the relevant receipts in order to prove that this was really a business expense. There are endlessly many arrangements concerning accommodation, but what is important is that it is fixed in the contract. And if there's a contribution or something, or a limit or whatever that the orchestra will pay, then this has to be fixed too. It has to be in there that you can prove that this was the arrangement. The same goes for travel. Again, an all-inclusive fee will mean that you have to make your own way there and you have to pay for the trip, etc. But many orchestras will pay either a contribution, or they will let you book your own travels and reimburse you up to a certain limit. So some people will say, you can fly in economy, or you have to buy a ticket up to that and that value, and so on. So these conditions as well, they have to be fixed in the contract. Now, all these aspects, the accommodation and travel, they have to be part of the whole package you negotiate. Because you stay in a place like Switzerland, for example, which is super expensive. Hotels are super expensive. Eating out is very expensive. And you have to bring this into the negotiation, because in the end, it's the whole package that either works or doesn't. Obviously, it depends on know how much you need a gig, if you're in the beginning or not. But in any case, it's important to bring the cost aspects in, because you don't want your whole fee to be eaten up by your hotel costs or your travel costs or your subsistence, what you spend when you're there during the time. Talking about subsistence, some orchestras will pay per diems. So they give you, in other words, they give you a contribution to your food and your drinks and so on. That's pretty rare. But again, if that happens, it would say in the contract. Now, just one more point to the travel situation. Some orchestras will offer business class tickets, sometimes even first class tickets. It's pretty rare. It usually happens on longer flights. So if you change continents or something. This is sometimes keeping in mind that some of the conductors simply are quite a bit older and they probably need to travel with a certain comfort. Sometimes orchestras have arrangements with certain airlines, and agents will always make this part of their negotiation. I, from my point of view, would say, be careful in terms of if this lowers your fee, because business class flights are very expensive. And if it comes out of your fee, you really have to think if that's worth it. If people offer it because that's just what they do, they have a habit of bringing people out on business class flights, that's great. But if you have to specifically ask for it and, maybe in some way or the other, this coming out of your fee, I'm not sure if this is worth it. In any case, this will have to be stated in a contract too. Then another aspect you have to look at when you negotiate the contract is something called exclusivity. Orchestras, institutions, opera houses that book you, they sometimes don't want you to appear either in the same city or the same country, same area within a certain space of time. They want to have you exclusively. And this kind of exclusivity must go in a contract. Meaning, for example, if you get a job in Finland, it might be that you can't go to a Finnish orchestra or another Finnish orchestra in the same season or in a certain span of time. Exclusivity seems sometimes like a bit a relic from another time, but it is still there. And quite some orchestras will insist on a certain standard type of exclusivity. Just be aware of that when you sign a contract. Then there are all sorts of marketing questions that you have to negotiate and put into a contract. One, for example, is the element of rights, video rights, audio rights, performances, rehearsals, your image when you're there. There's all the question of social media and so on. This has to be specified in a contract. In terms of marketing, I would be super flexible because if people use footage, they fundamentally use it to make people come to your concerts or to get the work of the orchestra known, and they do you a favor in a sense that they put you out there for people to look at you. So I would give them real freedom to use whatever they want from a performance. But also as a conductor, there is the aspect of video rights for recordings that you might want to use. Many orchestras, they have installed cameras so they can record rehearsals or they record concerts for documentation purposes and so on. So you have to ask when you negotiate if you have the rights to use these images afterwards. This will depend on many factors. For example, when the composer died, if it was within the last 70 years or not, then there are editors' rights and so on. But this is something that is good to clear beforehand and also to specify in the contract. That maybe a solution very often is that you give the orchestra complete rights to use whatever they want, interviews with you or rehearsal excerpts or concerts and so on for their purposes. And then on the other hand, you can use the footage for your own purposes as well. Then there's something super boring called a limitation of liability, which was important back in the COVID time, for example. Fundamentally, this regulates under which circumstances one of the parties can desist from the contract. So, for example, there's the question of force majeure. If a concert can't happen because it is natural disaster or just things happening that are out of the control of everybody. And so this has to specify what these conditions are or what has to happen in order for somebody not to stick with this contract. In a way, this is pretty important because, sometimes concerts get cancelled or rehearsals get cancelled. Circumstances change, but you still want to make sure that you get paid. So it's important that you know exactly what would give an orchestra the right not to pay you. And then, there are even some musical things you put into a contract. Things like repertoire and rehearsals, concert dates and so on, concert venues. If this is in the contract, it will give you a basis, for example, to book your travel because, the orchestra committed to something, committed to a certain number of rehearsals very often. That's why I personally think it's very good to put the rehearsals into the contract, because then after when this changes, it's harder for things to go just completely off the rails, that you suddenly just have half of the rehearsal time that you initially planned. And then I think it's also good to fix the concert program. In reality, when you sign contracts pretty early on, just after they asked you for a gig, for example, then there's still very much possibility for a program to change. But it's good to have something in black and white. Now, in all this, there are endless variety of contracts. Some of them are really long legal documents, several pages and so on, specifying every possible clause, many things that have nothing to do with the orchestra, they're just legal requirements. And other contracts are sort of super short and just state the absolutely necessary. Now, what I think has to be in every contract is it has to contain the fee, it has to contain the dates, and just the basic arrangements of who is responsible for what. So, for example, who books the trips, who books the hotel, who pays for it, just these sort of basic questions. And if something has to come out of your fee, like taxes at source or whatever other deductions, social security and so on, these are the sort of the total essentials that have to be in a contract. If there's no repertoire, for example, that's totally fine. It's nice to have something fixed, but it's not absolutely necessary. So I've talked about all this just in order to give you a bit of help with the whole contract situation. I realize this is not something that comes natural to many people. It's also pretty boring, but it's an important aspect. But within that, I realize that you have very different situations out there, and you also will deal with different contract issues. So please let me know if you have specific questions, and as always, I'll try to answer either by email or in another podcast. Write on Instagram or via the Conducting Coaching website, the email, or on my personal email, which is baldur@baldur.info. And have a good time until next week. Thanks for listening. To send us your comments or suggestions, please write us a message on Instagram. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date with all the Conducting Coaching news and events.